there, and welcome to In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment in the words of the people who made it happen. Hi, I'm your host, Pete Fenzel, and in today's episode we tell the story of Thanksgiving. Now, many of you already know the story, how the Pilgrims and the Native Americans came together and they sat together in peace in their log cabins, eating turkey nachos and watching football on TV, and how at halftime they went outside, and if they saw their shadows, that meant that they had another 3 or 4 weeks of autumn, right? No, that never happened. No, actually, the story of the first Thanksgiving is a story of almost unendurable loss, and how two peoples from such alien cultures, such alien belief systems, came together, and in a sublime moment of rebirth and hope, reinforced a relationship that would keep peace between them for decades. Before we tell the story of the first Thanksgiving, don't you think we should set the table? Who were these first pilgrims? Why did they travel and expose themselves to such hardship to settle here in the New World? And who were these Native Americans? And what terrible losses did they endure? And how did these two separate groups come together, first in interdependence and eventually in friendship and in trust? So sit back for a moment and let your imagination and your feelings help you to understand it a bit. The Pilgrims were just very common people from England who were called separatists, and they were called that because they wished to separate from the Church of England. Refusal to be a member of the Church of England was a crime in those days. And so the Pilgrims fled England in 1608 to go to the Netherlands where they could practice their faith more freely. And they settled in the city of Leiden for about 12 years. In 1620, the separatists entered into negotiations with the Virginia Company, which had established the Jamestown colony back in 1607. And they obtained funding from the Virginia Company to establish a new colony for themselves on the Hudson River in what is now New York. And so 2 ships were chartered, the Mayflower and its smaller consort, the Speedwell, to transport the new settlers to the New World. Now behind me is the Mayflower II, which is, as best as we can determine, a replica of what the Mayflower, the original Mayflower, looked like. And so, if we're going to tell the story of Thanksgiving, what better place than right here in Plymouth, Massachusetts? The Mayflower sailed from London in mid-July for Southampton on England's south coast, where she was to rendezvous with the Speedwell, sailing with passengers from Leiden. When the Speedwell arrived at Southampton, she was leaking very badly, and after repairs were made, both ships set out to sea. But again, the Speedwell was taking on water, and so the ships then put into Dartmouth Harbor for more repairs. In early August, both ships again set sail for North America, but 5 days into that voyage, the Speedwell was leaking so dangerously that both ships returned to England, to the port of Plymouth. Passengers and provisions from Speedwell were crowded into the Mayflower, which finally sailed from Plymouth for the Hudson River on September 6, 1620. She carried 102 passengers, separatist pilgrims, and adventurer investors who were enlisted for their vigor and their strength. The first 2 weeks of the voyage were fine, with the Mayflower running quickly before a favoring wind. But everything changed in late September. They were now into hurricane season, and a succession of terrible storms lasting until late October came out of the southwest, impeding the ship's progress. The Mayflower's log tells the tale. In sundry of these storms, the winds were so fierce and the seas so high, as the ship could not bear a knot of sail, but was forced to hull drift under bare poles for diverse days together. Imagine being crammed below decks in the Mayflower, not knowing whether one moment of the ship being tossed in gigantic seas would be your last. The hull of the Mayflower was staunch and strong and tight, but the superstructure leaked badly as the ship worked in the seaway. And so the Pilgrims were chronically wet and cold and filthy and sick. The Mayflower sighted land at daybreak on Monday, November 9th, 1620. They determined that they were at Cape Cod, almost 300 miles northeast of the Hudson River. They decided to continue the voyage down to the Hudson River. And so they set sail on the 9th, and about half-day sail down they encountered terrible shoals and foaming breakers of dangerous shallow waters with contrary winds that prevented any progress towards the Hudson. And so the ship turned around and went back up the Cape and anchored in Cape Cod Bay in the lee of the Cape. And there was great dissension among the people. Some wanted to continue the voyage to the Hudson, but many of the people were very, very sick, and they had had it. They were sick, they were cold, they were tired. It was time for them to get off the ship, and the idea of going on a longer voyage was a nightmare to them. And so they determined to stay up on Cape Cod and to find an appropriate place for a settlement. And ever since, for this reason, New Englanders have been Red Sox fans instead of Yankee fans. The passengers knew that they were far above the land grant from the king that entitled them to establish a settlement in the New World, and so the Pilgrims had to do something. They were beyond the law. And so on the morning of November 11th, they met together in the main cabin of the Mayflower and wrote out quickly an agreement by which they all agreed to establish a civil form of government among themselves. It was a government by the consent of the governed, based upon the popular vote of all the men who were on board the ship. We call that agreement the Mayflower Compact. And many believe it was the first instance in America of self-government by the people. For the next month, while remaining on board the Mayflower at night, they explored the Cape, they gathered firewood, they gathered fresh water, they fished and they hunted. People had started to die. So they sent an exploration party to the western shore of Cape Cod Bay. The party stepped ashore at a large rock near a good stream in a clearing with a cornfield. This was the place they chose to settle. When they returned to the ship, they learned that this place corresponded with the location of Plymouth on Captain John Smith's map of his expedition in 1614. So the Mayflower sailed across the bay and anchored off Plymouth. This was the end of her outbound voyage of 102 days from Plymouth to Plymouth. Thus, the entire company established themselves at Plymouth Rock. And it was long past time to do so. Okay, we are now playing tourist at the Plymouth Patuxent Museum here in Plymouth. Now back to our story. Throughout the winter months, the effects of scurvy, of disease, of pneumonia, of tuberculosis, and other fevers, of poor nutrition and deplorable sanitation took its toll. And during the months of January and February, 1 to 2 people died every single day, so that by spring, only 53 out of the 102 passengers who boarded the Mayflower survived. And of those 53, 2 were infants born on the vessel. The Pilgrims found themselves in a Native American village. There they discovered many graves and a lot of corn that was buried in them. And out of desperation, they took the corn to stave off starvation. They also discovered the remains of Native Americans who perhaps were the last ones to die. There was no one left to bury them. The name of the village was Patuxent. 3 years earlier, thousands of Native Americans died from a terrible contagion, many from the Pocahontas tribe, and all in Patuxent. With winter approaching and no dwellings built on land, the settler Pilgrims built a few common buildings on the land, hunted and fished, but spent their nights on board the Mayflower. The prospects of survival for the 53 settlers was slim. But everything changed on March 16th, 1621. That morning, a lone Native American walked into the settlement. He was described as tall, strong, and well-built, with long black hair down his back and short in the front, naked but for a leather loincloth, and carrying his bow and arrows. He approached the cautious and unsure Pilgrims, and he called out to them in English, "Welcome, Englishmen! Welcome, Englishmen! Do you have any beer?" The Pilgrims threw a blanket over him against the frigid cold of the day and provided him what they called strong water, cheese, biscuits, and butter. His name was Samoset. Samoset was a Sagamore, which is a minor chief of the Abenaki tribe up in Maine, and he learned his broken English from the sea captains and sailors who frequented the Maine coast. He was sent by the Massasoit, or the great sachem, or chief, whose name was Osamoquin, which means yellow feather. And he was sent to investigate the Pilgrims and what their purpose was. 5 days later, Samoset returned with Osamoquin and accompanied by 60 warriors, including a fellow named Tisquantum, and he spoke excellent English. Now, Tisquantum had lived in Patuxent, and in 1614, during the voyage of Captain John Smith to the area, he was kidnapped along with a couple of dozen other Native Americans by a fellow named Hunt, who was the captain of one of the ships. And Hunt wanted to make some money by selling these Native Americans into slavery in Spain. Well, Tisquantum was one of these, and when he got to Spain, some Franciscan friars intervened and freed him, and he made his way to England, where he stayed for a number of years. But he made it back somehow to North America and to Patuxent in 1619. And there he found nothing but death. And so he attached himself to the Massasoit Osamoquin. Now, having been decimated by disease, the Pecanicat tribe was now vulnerable to attack and absorption by a neighboring tribe to the west, the Narragansetts. And Osamoquin, being particularly pragmatic, saw in the Pilgrims a solution to his problem. And so on March 22nd of 1621, the great Massasoit Osamoquin established a treaty with the Pilgrims of mutual alliance and friendship. They made the following agreement. Neither would attack the other, and if others attacked one, the other would come to their aid. And they would hold their own people accountable for any breach of the agreement or any breach of the peace. This alliance lasted for 40 years until the death of Osamoquin in 1661. Now, Tisquantum stayed with the Pilgrims until his death the following year in 1622, and he taught them how to plant Indian corn and other survival skills that were essentially responsible for the survival of the Plymouth colony. Tisquantum was also the interpreter between the Pecanicats and the Pilgrims. So this brings us now to the first Thanksgiving. The harvest of 1621 was abundant. The Pilgrims had good reason to express gratitude and hope. William Bradford gave the following eyewitness account of the harvest. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and all had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck a meal a week to a person. And now, since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. The Bocanicat, although devastated by disease and grieving the loss of so many loved ones, had good reason to celebrate the harvest of their new friends who provided them with the added security they needed to survive. And so sometime, most likely in October, the Pilgrims decided to hold a 3-day harvest feast, offering prayers of thanksgiving to Almighty God for their blessings. Now, there's no record of any invitation going to Osamoquin or the tribe, but the Massasoit traveled the 40 miles to Plymouth with 90 tribesmen to join in the festivities. Edward Winslow, who became a great friend of Osamoquin, gives the only known eyewitness account of the first Thanksgiving feast. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. Now, the food that was available to the Pilgrims in great abundance, including venison, turkeys, ducks, geese, quails, pigeons, and partridges, cod, bass, eels, lobsters, crabs, clams, and oysters, grapes, berries, plums, nuts, Indian corn, squash, and roots, but sadly, there were no potatoes. So how did we get from Plymouth's harvest celebration of 1621 to today's Thanksgiving? Well, by the late 1600s, having a Thanksgiving celebration was fairly common in New England. And by the early 1800s, having a turkey Thanksgiving dinner had become an American custom. But it was not until the proclamation from the newly minted President George Washington that Thanksgiving became acknowledged as an American institution. Throughout our colonial and national days, having days of Thanksgiving were usually days of penance and fasting, basically for some military event or for some impending disaster. But Washington changed everything with his proclamation. Washington encouraged all Americans to celebrate Thursday, November 26, 1789, as a day of national thanksgiving for the blessing of the establishment of the United States of America under its new Constitution. No one knew better than Washington the thousands of impossible things that had to go right to bring our dear country to this point. And here's Washington's proclamation. By the President of the United States of America, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. And whereas both houses of Congress have by their joint committee requested me to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peacefully to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. And it goes on in that fashion for a bit more. Washington's proclamation was a one-shot deal, but it took the persistence of one woman to turn Thanksgiving into the annual national celebration of thanks that it is today. And her name was Sarah Josepha Hale. Now, Sarah Hale was the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, an extremely popular publication and periodical in the 1800s. She was a fiercely patriotic New Englander using her editorial pen, for example, to fundraise for the Bunker Hill Monument and to preserve George Washington's Mount Vernon home. She was most strident to promote Thanksgiving. She lobbied and pestered to no avail Presidents Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. In Abraham Lincoln, she found a receptive ear. Lincoln liked the idea as a means to unify the country in a time of civil war. In 1863, evoking Washington, Lincoln issued his proclamation of Thanksgiving also on October 3rd, to set apart and to observe the last Thursday of each November as a day of thanksgiving and praise. Congress tweaked this proclamation slightly by making the fourth Thursday of November as the date of the Thanksgiving celebration. Echoing Lincoln's devotion, President Eisenhower received from a housewife in New Jersey this poem to serve as the blessing at the White House Thanksgiving dinner table in the 1950s. Let us give thanks for the Lord's protection and take him by the hand. Let us give thanks for many favors, no matter how small or grand. Let us give thanks for many churches in which we may worship as we choose. Let us give thanks to him on high for Bibles we peruse. Let us give thanks just for being alive in a great country that is free. Let us give thanks for our blessings and pray for those overseas. Let us give thanks for our friendly neighbors who will heed our beck and call. Let us give thanks for a land of riches which has bountiful crops for all. Let us give thanks for many things as we go our merry way. But most of all, let us give thanks to the Lord for giving us this day. And so here we are today. Thanksgiving has never been about us. Gratefulness never is. But the essence of Thanksgiving has remained unchanged for more than 400 years. And so, to you and yours, happy Thanksgiving. That's it for our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, would you please share it with your children, your grandchildren, your family, and your friends. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you.